I always knew that I was different as a young boy. I was a bit sissy, I wasn't good at sport, I didn't join the gangs, I was a bit of a loner. And so I sort of realised that I was different. I couldn't put a name on it, of course. Only when I went to my first proper boarding school, prep school, that I started to look twice at some of the boys. My instinct drew me towards them, I would say. I suppose it wasn't really till I got to my public school, Harrow, that I sort of encountered the thought that I might be homosexual. And actually the moment of truth came rather interestingly. We had a visiting vicar to give a Lenten address to the whole school. And he was very provocative. He was quite a sort of theatrical type. And I remember him saying, we were all sitting there in the school chapel, all 500 of us, and he said, and 1 in 10 of you will grow up homosexual. And I thought, God, he's talking about me. Because I was, at that very moment, thinking, looking at the boy 2 rows ahead and thinking, God, he's cute. So I thought, uh-oh, that's me. So that was really my sort of total awakening to the fact that I was homosexual. But of course at school, people didn't think in those terms. I mean, boys having sex with boys in boarding schools in those days sort of happened. It wasn't talked about much, but it went on. And a lot of fun it was too. It was the only thing I enjoyed at school.
When did I realise I was gay? I don't think I realised I was gay until long after I started having sex with men. I mean, because I was in a single-sex boarding school, and there was a lot of sex that went on there. And I had my first sexual experience, I know quite precisely, when I was 11. And it was during the first screening of Doctor Who. And it was in this sort of room where, you know, all the little boys were watching Doctor Who, and me and this particularly delicious person were not watching Doctor Who. And it sort of went on from there. But to be honest, the term gay, I don't think even by the time I left school at the age of 18 that I'd heard that term or knew about it, and probably was pretty foggy about the whole idea of homosexuality. It was certainly not mentioned at school or taught, you know. And I was at school, I mean, I was born in 52, and so we're talking about, I think I left school in 68. So, you know, at 18 or so. So that sort of period. And so if homosexuality was decriminalised in 67, I guess I was a criminal when I was still at school, which is a sad thing to impose on young people.
And then after that, I went to university. And interestingly enough, the 67 Act was passed when I was 20, exactly. But it was only for people over 21. Well, of course, most of the people at university are under 21. So although I was legal, well, almost legal, the friends I made at university were not, because they were 2 or 3 years younger than me. I went up late for various health reasons and got into Cambridge, and my whole life changed. I had the most wonderful 3 years, but it was a bit of a sexual desert. Sex wasn't as easily available as it had been at school. That was really my awakening, and I came out, I didn't really come out properly until I got to London after leaving Cambridge.
Yeah, I mean, in the late 60s, I was 18, right? So I don't think I knew much about the culture. And I probably didn't even know that homosexuality was illegal because it wasn't sort of really talked about. So the sort of, I mean, probably I should have known. And the big scare things that kind of went on in the 50s and the 60s with people being prosecuted and jailed and all of these things, I think I wasn't really aware of that. You know, it was, to be honest, I was more concerned about my own personal feelings, about being rather horrified to discover that I was gay. You know, it was kind of fine at school, and then you left school and that phase was meant to be over, and then the girl thing was meant to happen, and it didn't happen. You know, like, so what's going wrong? What's wrong with me? And I think that was, you know, one's focus was far more about a personal issue, about not wanting to be gay, probably. I mean, I asked someone the question the other day, do you suppose in these liberated days that actually at some very, very early stage of discovering you're gay, that most people don't want to be gay? You know, the initial feeling is they want to be like everyone else. And that's what I felt then, too.
how in the hell do you tell your mother and father that you like guys? Well, my father was dead. He died when I was 11, so that wasn't a problem. But my mother was born in 1909. So she was, of a totally different era. And although she was liberated in many ways, the idea of homosexuality was completely abhorrent to her. And when I told her first reaction is, this can't be true, you're saying this to hurt me. When we sort of got round that, she never really accepted Derek, which was huge sadness to me, because how could you go on loving a mother who doesn't accept your partner? She was perfectly polite to him, but she treated him distantly, didn't remember his birthday, would spell his name wrong, and I didn't know whether these things were done deliberately, but I suspect they might well have been. And she just couldn't accept it. And she did say some of the most awful things to me. One of them was, when I was trying to tell her, I said, she said, you're obviously unhappy, darling, what is it? And of course I'll understand, whatever your problem is, share it with me. So I said, well, supposing I'd killed someone. She said, well, gosh, well, I hope you haven't, but, if you had, I would try and understand, and I'm sure there would be a good reason for it. And I said, well, what's the worst thing you can think of? And supposing I was homosexual. Oh, well, that's disgusting, darling. You couldn't possibly be that. So that tact didn't work very well.
I mean, it's ridiculous to think that people could think that being gay would be worse than going around murdering people, but they did.
And bless, I have to understand that she, was born and brought up in an era when it was a terrible thing to be gay.
It was, how difficult was it, this sort of feeling of coming out gay? I mean, it was difficult in that when I left school, I didn't go to university, I went straight to work. And quite soon after leaving school and starting work, I went to see a kind of counsellor or, some kind of a shrink about what was going on. But I think that person, I think it was a lady, was probably not very good at her job. And I certainly wasn't able to actually verbalise what I was worried about. A sort of wiser counsellor would probably have said, well, I think maybe you're gay. But that was never said. So I sort of left confused, and I remained confused for quite a long time.
The gay world in London, as far as I remember it, in the 70s, was really very small and tight-knit. And you tend to run in the same people and same parties and the same bars. Whereas now, there must be, 500,000 gay people in Greater London, I would think. But in those days, it was much, much more close-knit. And it was illegal still to publish the name and address of a gay place.
I was lucky enough, after working for a short period, to go on what then was called the hippie trail, and did this wonderful sort of hippie-ish trip across sections of Asia and India and the Middle East, during which time a girlfriend was with me, a close friend who potentially could be a girlfriend, and I tried to initiate sex with her, and that didn't work, and that was confusing both for her and for me.
It was rather a funny story, actually, because I knew that I was just on the point of coming out and I wanted to find gay bars. And I was at a straight dinner party with some friends, and one guy said, oh, we live in Kensington High Street, right above this queer club, where all these awful queens come in and make a noise and shout and scream. And so I sort of got talking to him. I said, where was that? Where is it you live? And he told me, and then I found the Sombrero, which was one of the most fun gay hangouts of the time.
And it wasn't until the whole of that experience had passed, and I was actually living in Paris at the time, and was lucky enough to clock eyes with this extraordinarily beautiful model, American model. And we almost immediately had sex, and he was completely relaxed about being gay. And, the sort of, what's the expression, fell from one's eyes, and you realise, well, this is who I am, and it's great.
This was the first gay bar I went to. And I, with fear and trepidation, went down the stairs to this cavernous cellar where there were lights flashing and Tamla Motown music playing. And once I was entranced. I knew that this was a place where I could feel at home and shed my sort of upper middle class carapace and just be one of the guys. And I found that really very, very exciting. And I started to meet people and go home with them and started to have a proper gay life in London. And there were all sorts of characters down there that stood out in memory. And there was one man who called himself Vicky de Rothschild, although no way was he a Rothschild. And he wore far too much makeup and always held court with a bottle of champagne, trying to attract younger boys round. He was like a moths to a flame.
And from that time on, I behaved like a gay person, embraced being a gay person, and celebrated it, as I still do.
Eventually, a man came up to me and said, "I know who you are. We were at Cambridge together." He told me his name. I said, "Oh, yes." And so I met my first real gay friend in London. And through him, I met his circle of friends. And then gradually, over time, my circle of friends grew and grew. But, we knew we had to be circumspect, I would say, not within our own group, but outside our group. And there was still an awful lot of prejudice, and people could lose their jobs if they were discovered to be gay. Employers were totally within their rights to sack someone for that. So people were very careful, and very often the generation before me was really the generation that still got married or went into the army or the priesthood or became a schoolmaster. Those were the sort of professions. The ones that could hide in society did. And there were some who were so flamboyant they didn't stand a chance, like Quentin Crisp, who was also a regular at the Sombrero, and he was quite a character, the stately homo of England, as he was referred to.
I realise how incredibly privileged and fortunate I am to be able to say that, because even within the context of England, like I read Lord Cashman's book, for example. Now, he was still struggling, if I remember correctly, into the 80s with coming out, maybe because he came from a different background or whatever. One of the gay activist organisations, I think it's Human Dignity Trust, who do great work, produced this map. And, if you look at their map on their website for the countries where homosexuality is illegal, it's very interesting because it's very allied to places where fundamental religious beliefs of any sort hold sway.
It's reputed that when Lord Beauchamp, who was a government minister, had to flee abroad because he was involved in a homosexual scandal, that when the king was told, he said, "Good God, I thought men like that shot themselves." And that was the attitude. And I think if my father had been alive, that would have been his attitude. He'd fought through the First World War, been wounded on the Somme. Any possibility that he could have a sissy for a son would have been absolutely abhorrent to him. And I sort of feel he even knew that I was, funnily enough. But, he sensed that I wasn't the butcher's thing going.
I met Jeremy some years after coming back. I think I came back from Paris and having this love affair with Tom in about 74. And I met Jeremy in 77. And during that time, I'd been living a gay life as well as all the other kind of lives one was living, pursuing a career and all of that. And I was actually introduced to Jeremy at I wouldn't say a formal lunch, but a much older, rather stylish American man who was in the habit of throwing lunch parties for sort of bien élevé type gay boys. I was a host, I was a guest at one of those, and Jeremy was a guest at that, and we'd sort of clocked eyes then and probably had sex, on that occasion or the next day, or I don't know quite what, but without there being a sort of an emotional, he was still seeing people, I was seeing people. I was 25, to be honest, I wasn't ready to jump into a sort of serious relationship. It was not until about a year later. I mean, Jeremy was very, very busy at that time because he was starting a club called the Embassy Club, and that absorbed a lot of his energies.
It was a revelation to me that people mix so freely within the gay world, people of different types, different colours, different class backgrounds, every sort of person. Once you were in the warm, enclosing ambit of a gay club, you were all just equal. And that was very, very attractive and nice.
The Embassy Club was a sort of maelstrom of kind of sex-induced partying, which was straight people, gay people. Remember, it was a fabulous, fabulous place at which all types of people were encouraged to mix and mix. In the early stages of that, there was almost no time to fall in love and get together, but there was an occasion that occurred when he invited me away for a weekend, and we fell in love during that weekend, in quite a dramatic sort of way. I mean, our experience of falling in love was not like a sort of decision you take, but it was, this thing kind of happened, and in a very beautiful way you kind of flow together. It was great, and very, I consider myself incredibly fortunate that happened, and I'm still with that wonderful person.
And eventually I met Derek, so then my life changed. But being in gay London in those days, it was a very small world. I didn't particularly like pubs. Most of the gay venues were pubs. There were a few coffee bars, a few restaurants that had a largely gay clientele, but clubs were very few and far between. And really in the 70s, the two sorts of clubs you got were either places like the Hammersmith Palais, which was sort of original Palais de Danse, or smart, expensive, exclusive heterosexual clubs in the West End, whose names usually ended in an A, like Sibylla's and Annabelle's and all those sort of women's names. And there was Tramp, of course, which was very well known, run by a man called Johnny Gold, and that did attract a sort of celebrity crowd. Annabelle's was rather snooty and sort of upper class, not much fun.
I mean, Jeremy and I were very fortunate in a sense that we lived in a major capital. If people were able to behave the way they wanted to behave, it was easier to do that in the middle of a capital. We were also already totally out because Jeremy, owned this not gay nightclub, but a totally mixed club, the Embassy Club, and quite shortly followed after that by Heaven, which was the sort of biggest gay disco in the planet, practically,
I have a lot of straight friends and mix a lot with women, like women a lot. In fact, as I grow older, I find I almost now like women more. I think straight men particularly, when they grow old, tend to become quite morose and not very talkative, unless you engage them on sport, which I know nothing about, or possibly politics. But women become almost more chatty as they grow old, and older women, I think, have always got on well with gay men. So we have a lot of women friends, which is nice. I think one shouldn't live in a ghetto. I think that's always a bad thing.
We were completely publicly out, so there was no issue for us, really. And amongst the people that we were lucky enough to know, there was very little opposition or problems that we encountered. Most of the people we knew seemed to be fairly relaxed about gay people being together. Now, in earlier times, that would have been different. I mean, in that clearly there were any number of very, very important and meaningful gay relationships that occurred and have been for hundreds of years, but they couldn't have been open. And, so it would have been this sense of having to hide what was going on. We were very fortunate, I think, and probably one of the very earliest, that it was actually very, I have to say, easy for us to be open. I mean, we didn't think about it for a minute, I mean, we just, if anyone wanted to know we were gay, and if they didn't like it, then they could fuck off, basically.
Well, Heaven came about because after I'd been to New York and seen the nightlife, particularly the clubs of the West Village, which were sort of all-night rave clubs for gay men with seamless music and guys with their shirts off and very heady and exciting, I thought, I have to bring this to London. I mean, there's nothing like this in London. And the first place I found that was for sale was the old Global Village and Charing Cross, which had basically come to the end of its days. Was very run down. And I couldn't initially afford it, but after the sale of the Embassy Club, I had enough money to buy the lease. And I embarked on this completely mad project. I mean, youth makes you very not risk averse, the very opposite. It just never occurred to me it wouldn't work. Whereas a sane head would have said, you must be mad. This is a club that holds nearly 2,000 people. You're going to find 2,000 gay men to fill this club 5 days a week? I don't think so. But we did. and it's still around. So that was quite something. So I followed my dream and did it, and it worked.
I mean, you'll no doubt ask Jeremy about heaven because it was his baby, and he can tell you more about the motives that were behind it. But he'd always wanted to open a club that was only for gay men. And interestingly, although Heaven became, this unbelievable success and still continues to be in business, which is quite extraordinary 40 plus years later, there was a lot of fear about it from within the gay world. There was a fear that this place was run by kind of rich people who were going to exploit the gays. And it was quite interesting that for its first month or so, I can't remember the exact time, we were worried that people weren't coming through the door. And then what changed it, which was actually very beautiful and very fortunate, was that Kenny Everett, who used to have this wonderful video show, the Kenny Everett video show, he shot one of his early shows in Heaven. And the Heaven logo was like flashing behind him the whole time. And it changed perception. And then, people came in a rush, and then people came in their thousands, and then people from all over the world came. It's like a ton of prima donnas, a lot of drugs, a lot of divas, a lot of,
Well, I think particularly in those days when homosexuality was still frowned on, gay men needed a place where they could celebrate their homosexuality with other gay men. And Heaven provided that place. And in a sort of funny sort of way, particularly with the use of drugs, it became a transcendental experience. The music, the drugs, the excitement, the sexual atmosphere. Yeah, and an atmosphere where all gay men could feel safe and not threatened. And so it was, in a way, like a religious celebration, going to Heaven on a Saturday night, completely getting off your face on something or other and dancing through till 3 o'clock in the morning, which I think was the latest. We had turned the music off at 3. It was a wonderful experience, and I'm very proud to have enabled that experience for many thousands of gay men. Wherever I go in the world now, if I'm in a gay milieu and I'm introduced, as I very often am, as the man who started Heaven, people go, wow, you started Heaven? Even in America, everyone's heard of it. And quite a lot of them have been to it when they visited London. So it is quite a calling card. But I've done a few other things in my life, so I don't want to be remembered just for the man who started Heaven.
That's what you have to do in a nightclub. You have to drive people to the edge of sort of frenzy and craziness and stay within the law, which is pretty tough. But anyhow, it succeeded, and it attracted a huge numbers of people. And I think, given the distance of time and what other people have said about Heaven subsequently, we now realize how incredibly important it was in so many people's lives, because it was a real sort of safe space. We started Heaven in 79, and we sold it to Richard Branson in 82 or 3 or something. So it's basically all pre-AIDS, and it was coming out of decriminalization that had ceased a long time ago. But for a lot of people, this was an amazing place where they could discover their tribe, and they did.
Well, as with all businesses that I name, I get the team that's involved, such as in the case of Heaven, to sit round and come up with a list of possible names. And then we refine it down until we're left with a short list of 4 or 5 and pick the name from that. And Heaven seemed just totally appropriate because we were trying to create this transcendental experience for gay men. And it was all in my mind. I'd seen it in New York. I knew what I wanted to create. Fantastic sound system with a lot of bass, a treble sizzle above, and fabulous lighting that would blow people's minds. I mean, people in London had never seen that sort of lighting before. And combined with all those bodies together and lots of attractive people, it was just a very heady experience. And the music, of course, made it. And the music was great. We had a DJ called Ian Levine. And Ian was totally, he and I were totally in sync of the sort of music we wanted to play, which we named High Energy. And that's what Heaven was all about, was this fantastic, seamlessly mixed music.
Very important, and I think Jeremy should be remembered for that, because it was brave to open a place like that in terms of the size and the commitment and the lease and the money, and of which we had none at the time. It was all done on credit. Anyhow, paid off. Mostly it paid off because it benefited so many people. That's the real joy of it, looking back on it and seeing that it really made a huge difference in a lot of gay people's lives and really helped them a lot, and maybe even found them a person to love for the rest of their lives. I'm sure that happened too.
It was heaven on earth for a gay man.
We became very conscious of AIDS at a very, very early stage. We used to go to a place in Florida, America, called Key West, which was the sort of epicenter in the state, or one of the epicenters in the States of kind of gay partydom. And we went there very regularly from about 81 on.
A painful subject, because we lived through 10 years of hell, really. And we lost an awful lot of friends to AIDS. But I first heard about it. We used to spend a lot of time in Key West in Florida, which was quite a gay resort and a sort of tropical place of sex, sea and everything else. And there we started to hear people from New York and San Francisco start to talk about this strange, rare gay cancer. And then I think New York Times, I think it was, that produced an article about this rare cancer in gay men. And that's the first time we heard about it. It wasn't called AIDS in those days. It was, first of all, it was called GRID. Well, gay cancer, first of all, then GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. And only later was it labelled AIDS. And at first, like with any disease, I think it was the same with COVID. You sort of heard about it, but didn't really think much about it because you thought, well, it's not going to affect me. It's something to do with these few extreme gay men doing extreme gay things in bathhouses in New York, so it's not going to affect us. How wrong we were.
If you remember, the seminal kind of New York Times article came out in July 81 that reported 41 homosexuals struck down by this thing. And we were going to a lot of the other gay watering holes at the time, to LA and to the East Coast and Fire Island. And, mostly the early people who died of AIDS within the gay community were in America. And we were there, so we heard about it very early on, which is probably one of the reasons why Jeremy took a strong lead in starting the UK's first AIDS charity, Crusade, which we started in about the mid-80s, something like that.
Because of our connection with Key West and the fact that we had friends in California and friends in New York, we started to find people that we knew were dying. So then you can't really ignore it anymore. And when I came back to London, I thought we must do something. There is no one raising money to help fight this disease and its consequences. So I got together with some friends who had a similar idea, and we started a charity called Crusade. And I was its first chairman. And we gave a launch party at Leighton House Museum in London, in which I gave a speech, and I'm not very good at giving speeches, but I gave a speech to about 600 people, in which I said, tighten your seatbelts. This disease is coming here, and a lot of people in this room are going to die. And it's time we got our act together and started raising some serious sums of money for all the things that are going to be needed to support people who are ill and dying and their families.
How it came about is that we knew about AIDS going on. We then went to see Larry Kramer's play, A Normal Heart, which had a production in London. And after that, I remember we went to this sort of like Thai restaurant or something. We're sitting there and saying, this thing is coming to England and we need to do something. And we did, with a group of other people. That charity was very UK-based, but it achieved a lot. We raised a substantial amount of money and played a role in funding hospitals and other things that helped people at that time.
So Crusade was founded, and the particular thing I was keen on was we had a personal hardship fund for people who couldn't afford to pay their electricity bill or needed a little fridge by their bedside so that they could have something to tempt their appetite, not just the hospital food. little things like that, or to send the carer on a long weekend holiday to get a break from caring for their dying loved ones. So I think we made a difference, in a small way. And that was in 1986 or 7. Don't remember the exact date. And then I left that after a few disagreements about governance, and became a trustee of the National AIDS Trust.
There was definitely a sense of terror stalking the land, but I have to say, we were young, and we wanted to live lives to the full, and we didn't stop partying, and we didn't get gloomy, and we didn't this and didn't that. We just hoped to hell that it didn't hit us. This New York thing came out in 81. The first person we knew to die of AIDS was an American who died in 84. The first person we knew who died of AIDS in England was, interestingly, Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister's son, Lord Nick Eden, his name was. I think that was in maybe 86. And it sort of ramped up, So for us, the worst period where our friends were really dying in droves was really from the early 90s until the arrival of antiretrovirals, which was in 96, 97. And during that period of time, we lost loads and loads and loads of friends. In my book, Living and Loving in the Age of AIDS, there's 40 names listed of people who were our close friends. And then, of course, there were, because of Heaven and Embassy and Crusade and all of these things, we knew a very, very wide circle of gay people. And the loss was terrible. We certainly knew people in the States, in the early days, maybe in the late 80s, early 90s, saying that they'd lost 90% of their base of friends. You can imagine 90% of all the people die, and they're not dying because they're old. They're dying, they're all young, they're 25 or 30, and a lot of people were dying in really horrid circumstances and, rejected by families, and, it was very, very, very bad, very bad.
And one of the things that amused me is that I was appointed by the government to this committee. And then I got a call from this guy, whose name I can't remember, and he said, "Mr. Maxwell likes to know who he's doing business with. Could you please submit a CV?" So I said, "Excuse me?" I said, "CVs are usually asked for people when they're considering being appointed, not after they've been appointed." But I said, "I tell you what, if Mr. Maxwell will give me his CV, I'll give him mine." So that was the end of that conversation.
There were two very different responses to AIDS in the States and in England. And of course, in England, it came about slightly later. And in America at the time, Reagan was a pretty ghastly person, in my view, and he was deeply, deeply homophobic. There's a shocking recording in the White House of some, people in the administration trying to bring AIDS to his attention. And his reaction was sort of like, who cares about the gays? Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that's what the bulk of American people thought, but the administration and its instructions were very unhelpful, and hence the birth of ACT UP and the amazing work that gay people did, amongst other people, to speed the development of effective medication, all of that. In England, I think actually I'm wrong in saying it was at the same time that Norman Fowler instigated all those tombstone ads. That was actually pretty much at the same time, I think, mid to 86, 7, 8, where it basically warned everyone in the country, and it was not gay focused at all. Everyone in the country needs, don't die of ignorance and all of that, went to every person in the country. And I think the British administration, in contrast, responded very sympathetically and quite sort of wisely about it. My certain sort of view is that actually AIDS, despite the very sad side of it and the ghastliness of it, actually speeded the progress of gay rights, in that the body of people, the mass of people, had a huge sympathy for us, that we were suffering this, indescribably tragic event. Of course, it wasn't just gay people, there were plenty of other people who were getting AIDS, but in the main it was gay people. So I think in a funny, perverse sort of way, it speeded the progress of the kind of gay rights that we've now achieved, civil partnerships and all of this great stuff.
I knew that, that one was a pretty good candidate for getting the disease, because although I'd been in a relationship with Derek for many years, we were apart sometimes because his job took him abroad and whatever. And of course, one did things with other people. And we had a sort of open relationship to an extent, but it was a very committed, loving relationship nonetheless. And I was in Miami Beach, South Beach, which had become a bit of a gay mecca. And one of my companies had actually bought a building there, and we were doing some work to transform the building. And I met this completely gorgeous boy and had a sort of very hot relationship with him. And he was the bouncer at the leading club in South Beach called the Warsaw Ballroom. Anyway, possibly it was him, I don't know, and who cares who gave it to me? It's not really the issue. But I started to feel unwell, and I had sores at the corner of my mouth, and I knew all the symptoms. So I thought, I think your number's up. So I called Derek, who was in Singapore, working on a job in Singapore, when I was in South Beach. And I said, you must come home as soon as you can. I think we both agreed we would be tested together. We both need to be tested. So we were, and he was negative and I was positive. And that was in 91, early 91. And in those days, the prognosis was not that good. And my T-cell count was pretty low. And it eventually got down to 70, which is really quite low. But I never had any major illnesses.
I guess the biggest event in my life was falling in love with my life partner, Jeremy, who I've been with for 45 years. We've lived an incredible adventure. He's been a very successful entrepreneur, actually not always successful, but an entrepreneur nonetheless. I've had a separate design business, which sadly, during the period of time that he was fighting for his life with AIDS, I felt it necessary to close, which was a big sadness in a way, but it's allowed me to do a lot of other things.
So I soldiered on, and meanwhile, dear friends were dying around us the whole time. It was just the most ghastly time. But what was so weird about it was that we'd be going to a funeral one day, or sitting by the bedside of a dying friend, and that evening we'd be out partying. Life went on, and I was in the club business. So, there was this very odd sort of dual life. And we were both still working really hard. I started my gym business during the middle of this, the worst part of this time, really. And I felt that I needed a challenge, something to aim for. I didn't want to just sit in a chair and wait to die. And I thought the only chance you have of beating this is by planning for the future and planning for an involved life in the future. But who knows? It could have been luck. I don't know what it was or why it was, but by some miracle, I survived pretty much unscathed.
Jeremy survived. Of course, that's the biggest triumph of all those triumphs. And we consider ourselves very, very lucky, he to be 75 and me to be 70, when there was a time when he, during the worst of the AIDS period, where he begged to be able to survive until he was 50.
Well, funny enough, the time I became the most unwell was a few years after I'd started taking triple combination. And initially I'd done very well, and my T-cells had gone up a bit, and my health seemed to have returned. And then around 2002, I think it was, I was hospitalized twice for a pneumonia, not PCP, another ordinary pneumonia. And I had a weird rash, and there was all sorts of things going on. So I knew that something was happening, but my viral load was undetectable. So it wasn't showing up in the viral load. But by good fortune, we knew in Key West a friend, gay friend, who was on the board of Robert Gallo's Institute in Baltimore, and he was one of the discoverers of the virus, the identifier of the virus, and he had an absolute state-of-the-art Institute of Human Virology. And this guy said, I'm going up in my private jet, do you want to come and have a consultation with the chief clinician? So I said, you bet. And I saw this guy, and he said, well, look, you've got a zero viral load, an undetectable viral load, and normally they can't do a genotype resistance test if you have a no viral load. But he said, we have developed a very sensitive test will enable us to do this. And that's what I propose to do. And I'll send you the results in a couple of weeks' time. So when I got the results, he said, the results basically said, you are failing on all the drugs you're taking. So you need a completely new regimen. And he said, these are the drugs you should take. So I showed it to my doctor in London, and he prescribed those drugs, and then I got well again, and have been ever since. So that was a huge piece of luck. I mean, eventually I think my viral load would have become detectable, and they would have done the test in London, but I might have gone through a year or two of being very ill before the reason was discovered.
Yeah, I mean, Section 28, I wouldn't say that the country took that approach. I would say that Maggie Thatcher and her team took that approach. Maggie, I guess, middle-class sort of respectable lady, had a deep distaste for homosexuality and thought it was a perverse and possibly evil, unholy, a set of circumstances. And she did not want children to be educated to know any of these things. And so she banned it. Well, that was clearly an appalling thing to do. I suppose one of the great things about all that, Section 28, is it gave birth to Stonewall, and all the activist organizations who, basically came into being on the tailcoats of Section 28. And it took a long time to repeal Section 28. I think it wasn't until into the 2000s, But, it was a ridiculous and, appalling piece of legislation from a very right-wing lady, who had her qualities, but that wasn't one of them.
I think that gay people in the West have achieved pretty much everything. There is some worry that with the present composition of the Supreme Court in America, that some of our gay rights, such as gay marriage, might be challenged and ruled to be unconstitutional, or rather the opposite would ruled to be constitutional, that states could say that marriage is only between a man and a woman. So there are issues in America, but by and large, in the West, we've got everything that we sought to get in a remarkably short time. I mean, our landlord here, who's now dead, Lord Montague of Bewley, went to prison in 1953 for being a gay man. And he suffered hugely as a result of that. And it was the scandal of the day. This young peer, convicted of homosexual offences and sent to jail. So yes, we've come a hell of a long way, but we mustn't forget our brethren in less fortunate countries. Particularly, I have to say, in the Islamic world, where there is a vicious anti-gay rhetoric, which leads people like the Sultan of Brunei to proclaim that a law that says that gay men should be stoned to death. Stoned to death. Can you imagine the cruelty that implies? Luckily, the force of the world's revulsion made him withdraw the law. But these are the battles we have to fight. And in a lot of countries, in Africa, where Christian missionaries, particularly from the United States, have given fundamentalist interpretations of the Bible, a lot of Africans have also been turned into homophobes. Uganda being a perfect example. Nigeria too, I believe. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I think that us fortunate gay men and gay women in the West should be focusing on those issues and trying to change those minds and change those laws. And that's a battle.
Civil partnership. I think it was an amazing event. It was an incredibly, incredibly important piece of legislation which ought to have happened, I would like to say generations ago, but obviously it didn't. And its arrival is something that is incredibly important. And in a way, it's just as important for straight people as for gay people, because it allowed straight people to realize that, we could enjoy the same depth of relationship and love and commitment and responsibility and all the other things that go with formalized relationships. We elected to become civil partners on the first day that it was allowed by English law, which was the 21st of December 2005. We, together with a whole load of other gay people, gay men, gay women, etc., famously Elton and David did it with a great sort of fanfare, I imagine, and we did it in a very sort of low-key way. But it was very, very significant and important to all of us, and we were very happy about it. And one of the reactions surprised us the most is how thrilled our straight friends were. Because, for a lot of straight friends, marriage is like, the big la-la-la event.
Well, we entered into our civil partnership really as much as for any other reason, because we thought that we should honour the work and sacrifice of the people who'd striven on our behalf to make this possible. Also, it made sense economically. If one of us was to die, there'd be no death duties on that estate if passed to the partner. So those were the two principal reasons for doing it. And we didn't think, we'd been together 27 years, we didn't think it was going to make any difference to our relationship. But in a strange, inexplicable way, it sort of does. And I think, I've thought about this a lot, and the reason I think is that particularly for our straight friends, it gave our relationship a status. They understand, straight people understand marriage, is what they all go through, and it's part of the passage through life for every straight person is getting married. And they can understand and relate to that. Before, they always thought of gay relationships as fly-by-night couplings that had no significance. Although in our case, of course, a lot of our friends realised we were very committed.
For us, it was like we'd already been together 25 years. So there was no kind of big romantic sort of fluffy, get the frock type event. But it was like, this is something which is important. I mean, particularly for us, at the age we were then, 2005, Jeremy was born in 47, 60 or so, getting on. Do I have the sums right? Yeah, maybe. Because we'd been around in the AIDS period and we'd seen so many people dying, we'd seen, any number of instances where boyfriends, long-term boyfriends, would have been kicked out of hospitals by parents who had never even met this person, because probably their kids had been closeted. Probably they may not even have known their kids were gay, let alone that they were dying of AIDS, this kind of stuff. And then there was also the whole business about inheritance tax. To lose your lover or your husband or your wife, and at the same time fined because of having to pay tax because you're not formally recognised, you then have to lose your home, sort of double whammy. So there were important reasons of that sort too, beside the romantic things. And we sort of hadn't really expected it to make much difference to our relationship, but we were actually delighted to find that it did. That the actual business of standing up and being formally recognised as a couple deepened our commitment. It didn't deepen our commitment to each other, but it sort of, it gave more sort of validity to our commitment to each other, that other people shared in it and supported it.
After our civil partnership, I felt it was such a momentous occasion that I was moved to write to the Times, and they were kind enough to publish my letter on the 22nd of December 2005. And this is what I wrote. Yesterday, my partner and I signed the civil register and became legally joined. This small event was, along with the other 600 or so civil partnerships entered into yesterday, an event of historic significance. The importance of yesterday's event was made painfully clear to me recently when my partner Derek's brother was rushed into intensive care, and I was denied information on his condition on the grounds that I was not a family member. He's now my brother-in-law. Had it been Derek and not his brother, I would not have been the official next of kin to my lover of 27 years. I grew to adulthood in a world where being gay was a criminal offence. Indeed, my friend Lord Montague of Bewley served time in prison for something that is now officially recognised in law. Such has been the social change of the last 40 years. I would like also to pay tribute to the very many friends who have died from AIDS and could not be with us to share this moment of joy. but whose deaths have in no small part helped to focus attention on such a manifest injustice. It's sad that the Church has yet again set its face against moral and social change. Reactionary forces within the Church have always been against every major shift in thinking, from the condemnation of slavery and the acceptance of the theory of evolution to the ordination of women priests, always having to recant at a later date. To remain relevant, the Church should be a moral leader, not a laggard. Finally, I would like to pay tribute not only to the campaigning work done on our behalf by Stonewall, but also to our Prime Minister and government for having had the moral courage to promote this piece of legislation that is a milestone in the history of the grant of civil liberties to the people of this country.
So what struggles lie ahead for gay people? Well, sadly, a lot. I mean, sadly, massive struggles, but in my view, mostly not in this country, mostly not in Western Europe. And now that we can't be discriminated against, or it's illegal to discriminate against, it seems to us that we've won a huge number of battles. Great. But in 77 countries of the world, homosexuality is still illegal. In 7 or 8, it's still a capital offence, i.e. you can still be killed for being homosexual. And that surely should be our focus. I mean, I feel that the same thing in like the battle for women's rights. You know, it's the same thing, that it's great for a certain bunch of women, it's great for a certain bunch of gay people, but around the world it isn't. And I have to say, it saddens me deeply that we take what we've won as a kind of cause to celebrate only and forget that actually, you know, that we are incredibly powerful. You know, we're a huge number of people, we've got a great deal of clout around the world, and that we should be working, all of us, a great, great, great deal harder to help all these other members of our gay family who still are living, you know, ghastly lives where they can't be themselves. And, I would really hope and pray that more energy could be given. I mean, there are plenty of organizations who are doing work in this field, but I think the mass of gay people in the West are happy to find themselves living such comfortable, out, liberated, untroubled lives, you know, and amen to that. But it's our duty to keep fighting. And I certainly want to keep fighting. I want to be part of the fight. And I hope more people will do so.
And look how far we've come. What an arc from the desperate days of the 50s. In the 50s, homosexuality for a man was probably the worst thing you could be. It was complete social death. It would probably be death to your career. And it was something that people were deeply ashamed of being. It's great that we're bequeathing to the next generation a country where they can grow up not in fear and fully express themselves and their nature.